Afternoon, everyone. I'm Stephen Floyd with Producer Ag, and want to welcome everybody over the noon hour here to our June edition of our virtual weather meeting with meteorologist Brian Bledsoe. Couple things before we get started here. Just want to remind everyone that there is a chat function to this meeting, and that is the most effective way for you to ask questions of Brian as we're going along, and we'll have a little Q&A session here at the end of the meeting as well. So another quick reminder, as people are finishing up with their spring planting, getting the double crop finished up and everything like that, might be a good idea to go ahead and set your appointment at the FSA office and work on getting your acres reported and 578s generated and out to the crop insurance folks. Kind of stay ahead of the game here and get acres reported accurately and timely by July 15th. And then one new thing we have this year, part of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act was the expansion of the base acres in the United States. Those acres have been allocated through the FSA office. From what I understand, the acres were allocated based off of your farm's history. So you might ask the FSA office about that as well and set an appointment to review the new base acre allocation. And that is due at the end of August. August 30th, I think, was the date they announced, which is a Sunday. So I think it'll probably be on August 31st, which is the following Monday. But the sooner the better, just in case we need to make any adjustments or anything like that. So with that, Brian's going to bring us some information on the near-term forecast between now and the next 2 to 3 weeks as we work our way into July. Looking at the pollination period that's currently going on in parts of Kansas over the next probably through mid-July on corn, and maybe the grain field period through August as well. So with that, Brian, I'm just going to turn it over to you so we can dive right in.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, Steve. Let's go ahead and see what we're doing in terms of drought index, not just across the state of Kansas, but also across the entire region. And this was just updated today. And you can see that we just obviously don't have much to worry about across the majority of the state right now. We've been very wet through this corridor of the country. All right, here recently, we've also been pretty wet down here in this corridor. Now, there are some spots over far west central Kansas that, believe it or not, have actually missed out on some of the weather that's been taking place. There's a little bit here over far north central and northwest Kansas, although this doesn't take into account anything that happened late last night and into the wee hours of this morning. But really, the main focus for the continued dryness that's been fairly relentless is still really up in this part of the country here. And I don't see that changing a whole lot going forward, simply because we've had so much water over the past 30 days across the state. I talked with Steve about this before we came on. If you remember, the analogs that I was talking about specifically pointed to June as historically being very, very wet across Kansas. And in fact, if you go back through some of those years, some of the biggest floods in state history have happened during these stronger developing El Nino Junes. And we had that, here recently, where there have been a lot of huge rains across the state. So if you look at what the past 30 days, and this is just an anomaly as a percent of average, some of these areas here, over 300% of average, close to 300% of average, even in the northwest part of the state, 150 to 175% of average. Here's some dryness here, okay? And then a little bit up here, but everywhere else, it's been wild in terms of that. I do some work for some folks up just north of Lincoln County, Kansas, and the past 30 days, they've likely had about 17 inches of rain. It's just been huge. And these are the smoothed over kind of 30-day totals here. And you can see where the problem areas are, right out here west, where I showed you, right up here, that have still had some rain. But it's just been so wet here across west central, and all the way across eastern Kansas. A little donut hole down here too. But for the most part, most areas have performed exceptionally well in terms of rainfall chances. Now, obviously, a lot of us have had more than we would like in this short period of time, but that's almost always how we roll with these extreme type of changes, where we go from not nearly enough to way too much. And then that kind of begs the question, are we going to revert back to not nearly enough as we go through this forecast? So what I've done is I put together 3 different models here. And these are just models. So I want you to just take it for what it's worth. And in some cases, they're not worth a whole lot at times. But I wanted to look at the trend of what these 3 models are. First of all, the European extended, the GFS extended, and the Canadian extended models. And this takes us right through July 24th. And what you're seeing here, at least with the European extended, and I'm sure you've seen some of these models all over social media or online or whatever, is that we are likely going to have a pretty significant ridge of high pressure build down in this part of the region. All right. So what that does is it creates these ridge riding storms that a lot of times will do just that. The main corridor might be up here, all right, but the periphery of that ridge fires storms. So the farther away you get away from the core of that ridge, you can see that those precipitation deficits go down. And if you look at most of Kansas, and this model has a tendency to be biased. So if the day that the forecast runs, it's wet, it carries the wet through those first 2 weeks. If it's dry, it carries the dry. So it's one of these things you almost have to look at every day to kind of find out what the trend is. And that's exactly what I do. But just spitballing here for the next 30 days, you don't see a whole lot of big concerns here across Kansas. And this week, and I'm not focused on that right now, I do that in my daily emails with you guys, but the rest of this week is going to offer some pretty serious rain chances across the parts of the state too. So that's likely built into this. So what we might be looking at here is a very wet first 2 weeks and then a drying period thereafter. And if we look at the GFS extended model, you kind of have that same configuration. Okay, something like that. A little drier here in central and eastern Kansas, but not dry. Just the tendency would be drier than average. And to be honest, I think a lot of folks could use a little bit of drying out, especially in those areas that have seen so much rain. And it kind of places the ridge again down here, somewhere over central and southeast Texas. If we look at the Canadian extended, it's doing the same thing. All right, ridge essentially down here. It's actually a little wetter in certain places, like doing stuff like this. It actually has a little dry pocket up here across eastern Nebraska and Iowa. But if you look at something that, you always try to look at something that might be long-term, scary, heat, dryness, or whatever. And in terms of what history has shown us and the modeling is showing us, not a lot is screaming that right now. Will there be some dry time? Yes, there will inevitably be. We're not just going to stay this wet through the rest of the summer. But there will be times when we also break that period down. So we're going to breeze through the models here, and then I'm going to look at some of the analogs. So if we look at the Euro seasonal model temperature anomaly forecast for July to December, we're going through that whole period of time here. And these models are, I shared with you earlier in the month that I export that data to you. So this is just kind of a bit of a recycle, but it's important to revisit those. In the European model, you can see on its June run, did paint some heat right here in the middle part of the country for July. August, kind of the same story right there. September, it kind of breaks down. Got heat up here in the northwest. Better heat signal in the eastern half of the state than west. October, we just lose it. November, we are active south, low torch over the top. December, same story. Very warm up here, cooler, active underneath. And you might say, well, we're kind of in between the two. And you're absolutely right. And I'm going to talk more about that when we look at the analogs here. If we look at the seasonal model precipitation anomaly forecast, you can see for July, we start to dry out a little bit here. Nothing huge and scary. All right. If you look at the color coding over here, it's nothing horrendous. But historically speaking, and I've said this at length since we've been talking, I worry most about that corridor right there drying out when we have a strong El Nino in progress, which we do. August, we still have some dryness there. It bullseyes it a little farther northeast. But do you see how there's not a lot of significant drying taking place down here across central and east Texas, where historically it's supposed to be and where some of those shorter range models do. I think the model will pick up on that here in a couple of weeks when it actually, comes out with its new run. But even western Kansas, right there in the white, generally average. September, we start to get wet again. October, wet. November, still average to wetter than average. And December, no dry signal in there. Now, I will qualify this model by saying the El Nino signal within this model is very strong. All of these models have a very strong El Nino signal. And I'm not spending a whole lot of time on El Nino right now because the table has kind of been set that that's the main influence as far as we get deeper into this forecast that's going to carry over into fall and into winter. In the shorter range, you're basically just talking about day-to-day thunderstorm activity and where the outflows end up. And are we going to keep moisture in? Are there any big systems coming through? But the driver in this seasonal forecast is still going to be that strong to possibly record-setting El Nino. The NMME seasonal model temperature forecast for July to December looks like this. It bullseyes the greatest heat signal up here, okay, for July. Not here in the midsection. Why not in the midsection? Well, because the soil is so saturated. The vegetation is up. Everything's going. And if we've got that working for us, that wet soil heats up a lot less during the day than if it was completely dry. Now, you might be saying, well, with all that humidity out there, our nighttime lows are going to be warm. Yes, I think that that's probably going to be something to focus on. The daytime high temperatures, we may not have to worry so much about, but those nighttime lows, because of all the humidity, we're not cooling down a ton. But in terms of the most robust heat signal, it's favoring the northwest part of the country. In August, we see a little bit of heat right there, but I still think really anywhere out here to the west is probably where the main heat is going to be. And why is that? That's because the water temperatures here are warm right there next to us. Even up here into the Gulf of Alaska are likely going to end up being warmer. September, still the strongest signals out west. October, we lose any type of heat signal in the middle part of the country, which, to be honest, would be kind of a change from what we've seen over the past few years, where the falls have been so hot. November, for the model to be putting in simply average temperatures here, that's saying something, that the weather pattern is probably going to be pretty active through the fall. And even into December, that activity is on the southern tier. The main warmth is across the northern tier. Let's look at its precipitation output. This is its July forecast. Does not have any significant dryness over us. We've got some dryness starting to show up here and maybe up here, all right? But in between, not so much. And then there's your monsoon. So depending on where this ridge sets up farther south, does it set up a little farther south down here along the Gulf Coast, or does it position itself up here across the Red River Valley? If it positions itself farther north, well, then it's going to push the storminess farther north. If it's farther south, then you'll run storms over the ridge like this. So I think that'll be something to watch over the next, few weeks to see where that happens. But if we look at August, that's where we have some dryness starting to show up. This actually makes some sense based on history and what some of the modeling is doing. Main monsoon channel is there. So if you live pretty much in the eastern 2/3 of Kansas, that's probably where your most stout dry signal would kind of show up. September, we break it down though. We still have a lot of tropical moisture coming up here in the west, courtesy of not only the monsoon, but likely some tropical moisture coming in like this. October, wetter than average. November, really wet along the southern tier, Texas, Gulf Coast. That's right on brand with a strong El Nino. And even into December, you can clearly see where that active storm track is located. But we still have, generally averaged, even a little above average there across parts of Kansas and southern Nebraska. What about the Copernicus 3? Temperature-wise, I only really look at these darker oranges and reds. This is where your stoutest heat signal is being placed with this model, not here in the middle part of the country. Same thing in August, biased farther northwest and south. September, We pretty much lose any stout heat signal there, except for the northwest. October is the same way. And November, average. Takes a lot for these models to put out just average. So to me, that would indicate a tendency more toward cooler than average temperatures during that period of time too. Precipitation wise, through the same time, there's your monsoon plume out here to the west. Here's your dryness starting to build down here along the Gulf Coast for July. All right. August, there's your dry signal there. Down here across Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, southern Oklahoma, but nothing up here farther north. A little dry patch right there. But you see where the main channel of moisture is right through here. And then we lose it. September, we see tropical moisture influences starting to pave the way again. October, wetter than average. Anywhere you're seeing the green, especially down here in this corridor. And November, active subtropical jet stream like this, drier over the top. Makes a lot of El Nino sense. So all of these models that I've just shown you are very, very much locked in to their traditional El Nino and strong El Nino signal. That's what you're seeing right there. The Climate Prediction Center issued their updated forecast last week. This is the July, August, September forecast. Notice where they have the dryness. Notice where the darker areas of dryness are. Right down here in central and east and southeast Texas, right along the Gulf Coast. For most of Kansas, doesn't paint that way. Good monsoon going here. Little dryness up here. Temperature-wise, pretty much anything west or east or south of that line, that's where you have the most to worry about in terms of hot weather. And I really think that's the story out here too, in the Northwest. Even some cooler than average stuff here in the middle part, because that's where so much rain has been happening. Okay. August, September, October, that dryness goes away. So it really kind of, any type of dryness that's setting in there, I don't think it's going to set up for months on end, because we're getting late enough in the summer by this time to where we're going to have the seasonal change. The El Nino signal really takes over as it should, but you're still dealing with monsoonal stuff here. No huge signal really anywhere though, in the middle part of the country. Temperature wise, same story. Look where the better heat signal is. Same place pretty much. West, southwest, and a little bit to the east. September, October, November, some of that tropical moisture expands northeastward. But again, no huge dry signal showing up here. September, October, November, temperature-wise, heat signal stays out here. October, November, December, very active through this corridor. Drier up here. You could probably even sprinkle some dryness up here too, would be my guess. But this is far enough out in the forecast, they don't get too shook and worried about that. But that takes us through that December timeframe there. And here's the October, November, December temperatures. Anything north, west, north, northeast of that line, you're probably looking at warmer than average, because that's what the El Nino does when it's this strong. All right, potential temperature and precipitation analogs for July. We've looked at these before: 72, 82, 97, 15, and 23. These are the temperature anomalies associated with those for July. That looks historically completely the opposite of any big heat that would set up out here. All right, cooler than average. Do I think this will verify up here? I'd say that the tendency for it to be hotter up here would probably happen more than anything. But there's no huge heat signal right here in the middle part of the country. That's very counter to what a strong El Nino does in the summer for the most part. Precipitation-wise, look where your dryness starts to set up. Down here in Texas, southeast Oklahoma, parts of Arkansas, and down along the Gulf Coast. A little pocket of dryness here historically, but for the most part, nothing scary here across the state of Kansas, or for that matter, across the middle part of the country. August, some heat up here. You can see it barely, but it's there. Cooler than average central and east. I would also think that there'll probably be a little bit of heat if that ridge gets going down here. There'll probably be some heat too. Precipitation wise, here's where your main dryness is. Here, a little bit sprinkled in across the state, but we expect that from time to time. As I said, it's not just going to roll with this crazy wet weather the entire summer, I don't believe. There will be some dry time. There's your main monsoon channel. So do you see what you're getting here? Around the periphery of that ridge, you're going to have storm complexes riding it and also some coming down like this too. September in these years have shown some heat in the middle part of the country and cooler out west. So we'll have to see if that behaves or not. But the models that I showed you aren't scared as far as big heat is concerned, but some of the analogs we have to watch. September precipitation, here's where your dry anomalies are a little more prominent. East and southeast Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, and down along the Gulf Coast before that subtropical jet really starts to rip in here. October, not huge heat anywhere, some pockets here and there. Some dryness in parts of the state, but look at how wet it starts to become. The Four Corners, Texas, we erode that dryness that was setting up down here. Across parts of Texas, southern Oklahoma, Arkansas, where that flash drought or that flash dryness has the best chance to show up. November, temperature-wise, cooler than average here because we are just bringing storms in historically this way. And precipitation-wise, you can see that it shows up there too. Drier up through here, okay? Active here, drier over the top. Classic El Nino of strength. December, a lot of warmth here. Right here, all the way through here. We are cooler out here. And there really wasn't any stout dryness anywhere, all right? Some of these years really offset each other too. But the middle part of the country historically shows up wet in these years when we have a strong El Nino in progress. So what I wanted to do is kind of break this down just with a simple bar graph. We'll just look at the precipitation ones for fall and winter. And this is Kansas, all right? So these are just 8 cities that I cherry picked. The green is fall precipitation historically for the strongest El Ninos that we have to use. So 82, 83, 97, 98, and 15 and 16. Those were the strongest of the strong. And why am I saying that? Because this El Nino that we're going to be dealing with is going to fall into that category and might even set a record for strength. So historically, when we have the real strong El Ninos, what you get is certainly areas farther west and southwest are biased with the heavier moisture, not only in the fall, but also in the winter. And then when you get to Wichita, you see we fell short of average moisture. Average moisture is right there at that dashed line. We fell short, not greatly short, but we fell short there in the fall and a little bit there in the winter, and then up in Topeka, even more so. So when we get in between those, the lack of a storm track to the north and the ripping storm track to the south, we kind of just sit in the middle there. And we're really not influenced by one or the other. We can be influenced by the southern stream, but it's usually out here in the west and the southwest part of the state. Okay, that's where the areas of greatest impact take place. And I don't have a lot of reason to argue with that. What about Nebraska? You can really see that even more so. So the farther west you go, look at Sidney, Imperial, McCook. Those are your big winners. Chadron's too far northwest, so you get clipped there, fall and winter. Valentine is too far north and west, you get clipped there. North Platte doesn't do bad, but you can kind of see it taper off. Look at Grand Island and Omaha. Noticeably lesser when we have these strong El Nino events regarding precipitation for fall and winter. So you kind of have to find that sweet spot. And there are some of these areas that are definitely not in that sweet spot. Not that they're just getting crushed by dryness, but they just simply miss out on the storm track because it's more robust farther west and farther south than usual. So what possibly lies beyond this El Nino? This is a long way out there. So over here is May, June, July of 26. There's December, January, February as we move into 27, and over here's 28. What we have here is strong El Nino signal until we get to about April, May, June of 27. And we rapidly lose that El Nino signal. While that's happening, we start to build a La Nina signal. So this is something that troubles me for a couple of reasons. First of all, this El Nino is going to linger into, I think, at least the first third of 27. It's strong enough that I just don't see it rapidly going away early in 2027. So what that's going to do is that's still going to put extremes in the forecast, much like what we've seen, where we went from crazy dry to the water not shutting off. And we might have to deal with some of that stuff going forward. The other part of this that spooks me a little bit is we're going to bounce back to La Nina. That's what these analogs are showing me right now. We do that historically too. After we come off a strong El Nino, we historically will revert back to a La Nina. And in some of those cases, those La Nina events have been very strong. That is not a good look for the western third of the state. And for that matter, the majority of the state. La Nina, we struggle a lot of times with it. All right. Unless you're in the far northeast or eastern portion of the state. So I think we have to be very mindful of this going forward. Even if this is a little bit overzealous with the development, I'm not just looking at the model here. I'm looking at what has happened in history when this has taken place. So I think that that's something we're going to have to watch pretty closely going forward and be able to plan accordingly for too. And if you look over here, and again, I know this is a long ways out here, even right through the end of 27 and into 28, you see where the propensity is for us to live up here into La Nina territory. Sometimes historically, when we come off of that real strong El Nino event, we can have a double dip La Nina event. The reason I say this sucks is because we're bouncing back and forth. All right. I hear so many people talking about how extreme the weather has been. This is the reason. The Pacific is not in a state of neutrality very long before we see one of these things show up. And that's going to keep those extremes going in the forecast. This is going to change, but I've shared a lot of this with my West and Southwest Kansas customers because they need to be preparing for this kind of thing. They need to be very judicious with the water that they use and the planning going forward because we may be reverting back to this, sometime in the not so distant future. So just some bullet points here for you. The strong record-setting El Nino will likely influence our forecast into at least early 27. Every El Nino is different. I cannot underscore that enough. Every El Nino is different with different nuances that can sometimes buck those historical trends. So we have to stay very current with those trends to see how they're behaving. So, I know I showed you those analogs. That's great. That's what history shows us, but we kind of have to watch how things unfold. Historical trends do suggest ample time to see drought recovery for a large area. And not just short term, like what we've seen with some of the flooding that's gone on, but by drought recovery, I mean not immediately bouncing right back into dryness because the fall and the winter kind of look active, at least for parts of the region. As I showed you, not everybody, but parts of it. And then that La Nina return possibly later in 2027, I think is something that we have to obviously be mindful of. So with that in mind, if you guys have questions, please fire away.
Yeah, Brian, just going back to, what we were talking about with the temperature in July and August, it looked like it was kind of a little bit hard to tell there. I mean, are we more neutral or a little bit below, or are we going to see some high temperatures? I guess neutral, a little bit above. Is there some heavy 100-degree weather coming toward us, or is it going to be just
not at this
a little
time?
Bit of heat? Okay.
There's not. Now, we're inevitably going to see some heat. All right. But right now, the southwest part of the state and the south part of the state are the ones that have really just seen it. And the thing is we've not only in the past 2 days shoved a lot more water in the ground in those areas, but we're probably going to do that off and on over the next, 4 to 5 days too. So the more water that's in that soil, the less likely we have to battle that exceptionally hot weather. That hot weather focus shifts farther west. So, in western Kansas and southwest Kansas, yeah. Why? Well, because That's the high desert. The soil is drier out there. So there is a better chance for that. The farther east you go, I mean, I'm much more concerned about the humidity. I mean, most of Kansas is going to have a ton of water to bake out of that soil, and that's going to inject a lot of humidity in the air. So, in terms of, I think you have much more to be concerned about in terms of humidity and warmer nighttime low temperatures than just off the chain extreme hot temperatures during the day. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And then on the, just touch on the moisture forecast for August. It looked kind of like really similar, maybe some dryness coming in, but not extreme dryness. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I would say that for the farther southeast you go, there's a better chance that you're going to get underneath that ridge that's likely going to develop across Texas, and the harder it is going to be to catch those more frequent rains. So if there is an area that I'm concerned about, it would probably be that instead of areas farther west and northwest, because those areas are going to be in closer proximity to the monsoon that's going to be taking place out west too. So I know everybody, everybody's always waiting for the next shoe to drop when we've seen this much water, during the course of the month. Do I see something big, awful, nasty, and scary that's going to just, wipe us out? I don't at this time. But again, I think it's very important to see where this ridge of high pressure sets up and how persistent it's going to be over Texas before we can even say, oh, August is going to be this. All right. It's really going to require some babysitting, in my opinion.
Gotcha. Okay. Excellent. And I think you kind of touched on this just now, but I mean, it sounds like we're in for some moisture over the next 7 days. The 10 to 14 day precipitation outlook. I mean, what's your confidence level there based on what you're seeing?
I think the front part of that period has a much better chance to see wetter weather, and then we start to dry out a little bit. So if you're just simply looking at a 10 to 14 day period, let's just look at the 10-day period, because I'll be honest with you, on a day-to-day basis, a lot of times the models are not going to be agreeing on where the rain placement is, because these are thunderstorms. It largely depends. Today's forecast determines a lot on what happened yesterday, and tomorrow's forecast determines a lot what happens today. So I think the next, I would say probably right through Friday and into Saturday is probably going to be the wettest part of that forecast, and then we start to dry it out a little bit beyond that in that period.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
So, and I know this one's probably a long ways out there, but as far as like, what weather variability, you give us a little bit of that moving into fall, but I mean, is there anything that indicates like an early frost or anything like that from what you're seeing so far?
An
Or is
early
it
frost,
yeah, or is it too early to tell?
it's early to tell, number one, but uh, with El Ninos, all right, we keep that storm track going into fall and don't bring a ton of cold air south. Okay, you saw where that tendency for the warmth to be taking over up there to the north, and farther south, that average to cooler than average weather is more indicative of just the storm track being active. There's more clouds, there's more precipitation. That being said, I have looked at some analogs, just cherry pick certain analogs later in the forecast period. And if you are a rancher or a farmer across western Kansas, I think all of us remember the huge blizzard in October of '97, and '97 is one of these analogs that's in there. That doesn't mean that we're going to have something like that. But whenever I look, and I think that's one of the reasons, like you saw places like Liberal, Dodge City, Garden City, Goodland, those areas farther west are more under the influence of these bigger systems that come out of the southwest than maybe areas farther east. And they would have more of a tendency to capitalize on some of that colder, not necessarily cold, but colder air to maybe get some snow in here. But we're talking a long ways out there. I've got a lot of work to still do on that, but 97 is in there, so we have to be at least mindful of that.
Excellent.
Stephen, I think it owes too to the fact that when I set these analogs for us back in the fall, many months ago, and I was looking specifically at that subset of years where we were likely going to have a rapidly building strong El Nino as we went into summer. And a lot of those years in 57 and 65 set alarm bells off in my head because we saw big floods in June of those years. And you see what we've seen this June. So these analogs, they're never perfect. But when you see extreme events being brought on in history by some of those same extreme events that have precipitated those in the past, you have to be mindful of that going forward. And that's the only reason why I bring up 97. It doesn't guarantee anything like we had in 97 in October, but you at least have to pay attention to the fact that's there.
absolutely.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Well, I don't see any other questions in the chat or have anything else for you, Brian. But as always, thank you very much for joining us today, giving us some valuable information and insight on what we can expect. So we will see you next time. Thank you, sir.
Sounds great. Thank you, guys. Be well.